Okay, good afternoon. My name is Sandy Maeshiro. My first trip to Cuba was in 1970 as part of the Vencedemos Brigade. We spent 4 weeks on the Isle of Youth working in citrus production. There was a large Asian contingent in that brigade, and we were invited to the Harada Farm for a gathering. And this was the first time that we learned that there was a sizable Cuban-Japanese population, particularly on the Isle of Youth. At that time, I was deeply moved by the Cuban Revolution. We met people from all walks of life and learned how collectively the Cuban people rose up and paved their own way into history. They worked to build a socialist society free of racism, exploitation, and human suffering. It had always been my hope to return to Cuba, and 31 years later, I was fortunate to be part of the NCRR delegation along with my husband and my 2 adult children. Even though the Cuban people had suffered through many hardships after the Soviet pullout in the early 1990s, they didn't lose their faith. And again, I was touched by their resiliency, their strong love for their country, and their revolution. Many times we heard the phrase, no es fácil, which means it isn't easy. And I often thought, what an understatement. We learned that the Cubans were starving, and yet they would not succumb to the pressures of the U.S. government. They persevered, and today they stand as a beacon to other struggling countries in Latin America and the world. During the trip, when we were on the Isle of Youth, we split up into small groups and went to visit different families. And the family that we went to visit it wasn't actually a family, it was a single woman who had been born and raised in Cuba. Her father was Japanese and her mother was Cuban. And she had relatives who had left Cuba shortly after the revolution and actually lived in a suburb in Orange County. And she was able to come to visit them, I guess about 3 or 4 years before our trip, so that was sometime in the late 90s. Her sister, who was living here in the U.S., had urged her to stay and to not return to Cuba because life was difficult. And she said, no, I have to go home. That's my home. She said, I know everybody, we take care of each other, and I'm going to go home. And she showed us the pictures of, this very nice home in, I can't remember where, Mission Viejo or something like that. And this woman lived in a very modest home. She didn't have much, but this was her home, and this was where she wanted to live. Other people went to meet with other families and heard other stories about what had happened during World War II, the struggles that many of the Cuban-Japanese families had endured. We also visited the cemetery, which was very interesting, and they had a small, I don't know if you call it a service, but I guess like a memorial while we were there. Let's see. So our trip to Cuba in 2001 to celebrate a bond with the Cuban-Japanese on the Isle of Youth was an exceptional experience. We learned about their sacrifices during World War II and the role of the U.S. government, and we learned about their many contributions to the Cuban Revolution. The Cubans have much to teach us about democracy. We went to a meeting where women literally were taking off their aprons, but they had been elected to this community board. And they showed us an electoral map and how they made sure that everyone voted, and it was democracy on a very grassroots level. They also taught us a lot about how to care for the young and for the elderly. We met an old Issei man who was living in a nursing home. And when Kathy and I think Evelyn saw him, they started singing, and he knew the song immediately, and he broke out in this huge smile. And then we went to visit him at his home, and all of the workers came out to greet us, and it wasn't like a nursing home that you would ever see in the United States, that's for sure. In short, the Cubans have taught us how to build a society based on equality and free of exploitation. So now Jenny's going to share some of her stories.
One of the things that struck me when we were there was, my husband is his great aunts and uncles have farms in central and eastern Washington. And when we were on the Isle of Youth, we met the Harada family farm, and they shared some wonderful watermelon. And I think they supplied most of the watermelon for the country, I think, something like that. And so we all sat around in chairs in a circle, and when these women were talking, they looked like the great aunties. They sounded like them, except that they were speaking Spanish instead of English. But the way they dressed, the way they carried themselves, it was like these are Nisei farm women who've had hard, difficult lives, and the similarities were just really struck me very closely. What Cuba lacks in material goods, they make up with very amazing social programs. When we were there, I was reminded of the phrase, "When life gives you lemons, make lemonade." After the revolution in 1959, the U.S. imposed a trade embargo against Cuba, penalizing other countries that engaged in trade with Cuba. When the Soviet Union collapsed and pulled economic support in the 1990s, the economy took a big downturn. And everyone that we talked to would mention the special period and when the economy almost collapsed, and said, yes, that was a very special period and it was a very difficult time. But when we went in 2001, things had changed a little bit. Due to shortages in medical supplies, equipment, and medicine, Cuban doctors turned to alternative forms of medical treatment, learning about homeopathy, herbal medicines, energetic healing, and basic nutrition. In fact, we went to a medical clinic, and you could see all of the different things that the alternative types of medicine that they practiced, and it was really amazing. We also went to a medical clinic. It was a medical clinic, and it's not like here where you have, you go to the doctor, you wait, you have a hospital. They actually had the doctors, and they lived there, I don't know if they took long shifts, but they would be there overnight. So if something happened to you at, 2 o'clock in the morning, you could just go and knock on the door, and then they would see you and care for you. And so that was a really different way of treating people and helping people who are sick and need help, as opposed to the healthcare system here. Also on the farms, we visited an organic farm. So they didn't have oil for tractors, and they didn't have poisonous fertilizers. So they turned to organic methods of farming, learning about mulching and using organic nutrients from, they were raising rabbits to, create their own fertilizer, and growing the most delicious fruits and vegetables that they made a really wonderful lunch for us. This was a Nisei family, actually a third-generation family, I believe. And it was interesting to me, too, that when some of us couldn't speak Spanish, but yet they were able to. I heard Kathy and Evelyn, I think, speaking in Japanese for the first time. So that was really great that we could communicate in some levels. What we found was that with shortages of meat and milk products, they had created and planted over 30,000 organic gardens during the special period. So those were some of the interesting things. We also went to in Pinar del Rio. Mm-hmm. It's a province west of Havana where it's very rural and former coffee plantation area. So in 1968, Fidel Castro had designated the area as a natural preserve, and so they had reforested the area to stop erosion and planted, I think, something like 6 million trees in this area. And so the farmers were paid salaries to create these reforestation projects and given health care. Also at that area, they created an artist colony, and community housing was built in the early 70s. And then in the 90s, they built the first eco-hotel with, I think, compost toilets and using solar energy. And the trees were kind of going through the hotel and things like that. So it's, many things that we can learn from the way that they, created lemonade out of lemons, or lemons out of lemonade, something like that. So today, that place that we went, Las Terrazas, is a well-known ecological research center. So those are just some of the stories. Thank you.